Imperial Japanese Navy. Pacific Ocean. Late War period, 1944–1945. Night shortly after the guns fell silent. The firing stopped almost as suddenly as it had begun. For several violent minutes, the sea had been lit by explosions and burning fuel. Then, just as quickly, darkness returned. No more flashes, no more incoming shells, only drifting smoke and the low crackle of fires where ships had been moments earlier. On the bridges of Japanese warships, officers began the count. This was standard procedure. After a short engagement, losses were assessed immediately, enemy ships destroyed, damaged, or driven off. Wreckage floating on the surface was taken seriously. Fire on the water meant fuel. Debris meant broken hulls. Silence meant withdrawal or sinking. By those measures, the exchange had gone well. Several enemy ships were clearly gone. Wreckage marked their positions. One hull burned steadily, then faded into darkness. Another had vanished entirely, leaving only oil and scattered debris behind. The tally was made. The enemy had lost a ship, possibly more. Japanese commanders began adjusting posture. Courses were modified. Some ships prepared to disengage, others to reposition for what came next. The most dangerous moment, contact, appeared to have passed. Then the radar operator spoke. Quietly at first. He was looking at something that shouldn't have been there. On the scope, a contact remained where none was expected. Not a fadding echo, not debris scattering randomly. A clean return, steady, coherent, and moving with intent. At speed. The officer asked for confirmation. Another sweep came in. The return held. Bearing shifted predictably. Range closed slightly, then stabilized. This was not a wreck. This was not a drifting hulk. It was a ship. One that had been counted as lost. The bridge fell silent, not with panic, but with confusion. The tally was rechecked. Visual reports were repeated. Wreckage had been seen. Fire had been observed. The assumptions were sound. And yet the radar picture refused to cooperate. The destroyed vessel was maneuvering. More than that, it was repositioning. The tactical picture changed instantly. What had looked like a clean exchange was now incomplete. The Japanese fleet was no longer reacting to absence, but to survival. One enemy ship had absorbed punishment, disappeared into smoke, and stayed operational long enough to remain dangerous. This was the most destabilizing kind of realization. Not that the enemy was stronger than expected, but that it had not left the battle space when logic said it should have. Radar made that undeniable. While officers above water counted wrecks, the unseen ship had been counting something else: movement, spacing, and exposure. The moment Japanese ships relaxed, believing the fight had ended, the surviving enemy vessel gained leverage. The battle had not paused. It had shifted phases. The count that mattered was no longer how many ships were gone, but which ones were still moving. And the one that was missing from the wreckage was about to matter more than all the rest combined. The wreckage told a convincing story. Floating debris spread across the water in irregular patterns. Oil slicks glimmered faintly in the dark. A fire burned low where a ship had clearly taken a fatal hit. For officers trained before radar dominance, these signs carried authority. Ships that left this kind of surface evidence rarely returned to the fight. But late-war naval combat had changed the meaning of evidence. Radar did not care about smoke or flame. It did not interpret debris as finality. It tracked motion, and motion alone decided whether a ship was alive in a tactical sense. The missing vessel had survived by doing exactly what doctrine now encouraged: disappear without disengaging. When it was hit, the ship did not counterfire wildly. It did not illuminate itself. It reduced emissions, masked itself inside smoke and wreckage, and let the surface tell a misleading story. Fires were contained quickly. Damage control teams stabilized the hull just enough to preserve speed and steering. To the eye, it looked finished. To radar, it never stopped existing. This difference mattered immediately. While Japanese officers relied on visual assessment to declare results, the surviving ship used radar to maintain awareness. It tracked Japanese movements even as it appeared absent. It watched course changes that signaled relaxation. It saw spacing widen as the engagement was mentally closed. The ship had not escaped. It had waited. This was the cruel advantage of late-war sensing. A vessel could be damaged, burning, and still tactically lethal as long as it could move and observe. The old sequence of naval combat, hit, sink, reset, had been replaced by something less intuitive. Hit no longer meant removal, and wreckage no longer meant certainty. By counting debris instead of motion, Japanese command closed the fight too early. The tally created confidence. Confidence reshaped posture. Posture reshaped exposure. Radar saw all of it. The missing ship did not need surprise in the traditional sense. It already had something better, knowledge of when the enemy believed it was gone. That belief created a window, and windows in modern naval warfare were brief, decisive, and unforgiving. The radar return sharpened as Japanese ships adjusted course. This was the moment everything shifted. After the tally, the fleet began to reorganize. Some ships slowed, others altered heading to widen spacing. Gunnery readiness eased slightly as crews reset after the exchange. These were small changes, routine, disciplined, and sensible. They were also visible. On radar, those adjustments drew clean, readable lines. The fleet was no longer fighting, it was transitioning. That transition exposed intent more clearly than combat ever had. The surviving enemy ship reacted immediately. It increased speed, not dramatically, but decisively. It did not charge blindly. It repositioned along a vector that maximized firing angles while staying outside visual range. Radar solutions were recalculated continuously, refined by every Japanese maneuver. The battle had entered a new phase. Japanese commanders now faced a problem they had not planned for. An enemy that was supposed to be gone was actively shaping the engagement. The fleet was no longer dealing with absence, it was dealing with persistence. Orders were revised. Guns were remanned. Courses were adjusted again, but these reactions lagged behind the radar picture. The surviving ship had already anticipated them. It was acting on prediction while the Japanese fleet was reacting to realization. This asymmetry defined the rest of the encounter. The missing vessel had turned survival into leverage. It did not need overwhelming firepower. It needed only to exploit the brief moment when confidence replaced caution. That moment had already passed. The count had been wrong. And in late-war naval combat, a wrong count could be more dangerous than a missed shot, because it convinced you the fight was over when it had only changed shape. The surviving ship did not rush to announce itself. That restraint mattered. In earlier eras, a damaged vessel that re-entered combat did so loudly, guns blazing, desperate to prove it was still alive. In this engagement, survival itself was the weapon, and revealing it too soon would have wasted the advantage. Instead, the ship stayed just outside visual certainty. Smoke still clung to the water. Fires from destroyed hulls continued to burn low, casting uneven light that confused distance and scale. Against that background, the missing ship blended perfectly, not invisible, but unremarkable. Radar did the rest. From inside the plotting room, Japanese ships appeared as a loose constellation rather than a single shape. Formation discipline had softened, bearings shifted without urgency, speeds no longer matched precisely. These were not errors, they were signs of a fleet transitioning out of combat. That transition was the opening. The surviving ship adjusted course to exploit it, not by closing aggressively, but by aligning itself along predictable movement lanes. Radar solutions matured quietly. Fire control teams recalculated without pressure. no one was reacting anymore. They were choosing. The first shells fired by the lost ship landed with surgical intent. Not a broadside. Not a dramatic volley. A measured strike against a ship that had turned just enough to expose itself while resetting position. The impact arrived without warning, not because the Japanese crew was inattentive, but because they were not expecting fire from a ship they believed destroyed. Confusion followed instantly. Was this a new enemy? Had another ship entered the fight? Or had the count been wrong? Radar answered faster than debate could. The contact that had never disappeared now flared brighter with recall and movement. The truth settled in with uncomfortable clarity. The ship they had written off was still very much present and now dictating tempo. Japanese commanders issued corrective orders immediately. Guns back to full readiness. Courses adjusted to re-establish arcs. Attempts made to recenter formation. But these actions arrived late. Every maneuver fed the radar picture that the surviving ship had already internalized. The advantage did not come from firepower, it came from timing. The moment of relaxation had already passed, and it could not be reclaimed. What followed was not a reversal of the entire battle, but a reshaping of it. The Japanese fleet was forced back into a reactive posture, responding to a threat it should have eliminated minutes earlier. The psychological shift was as damaging as the physical one. Confidence fractured, assumptions collapsed. Every new radar contact was now suspect. Had another ship survived? Were more wrecks incomplete? Doubt crept in where certainty had existed. This was the hidden cost of miscounting losses in a radar war. The error did not just leave an enemy alive, it poisoned decision-making afterward. Every choice now carried hesitation. The surviving ship did not need to destroy the fleet. It only needed to remind it that the battle was not finished. And once that reminder was delivered, the tactical balance, however briefly, belonged to the ship that refused to disappear when the wreck said it should have. The second impact broke more than steel. It broke certainty. Once the Japanese fleet understood that a ship believed destroyed was actively firing, the engagement entered a far more dangerous phase. This was no longer a question of tactics alone. It was a question of trust in reports, in observation, in the assumptions that guided every order. And that trust began to unravel. Bridges demanded clarification. Radar rooms were pressed for confirmation. Lookouts were ordered to rescan wreckage that was already burning or sinking. The same evidence that had justified the original count was now suspect. Smoke that once meant destruction now meant concealment. Silence that once meant sinking now meant waiting. Every familiar signal had lost reliability. Orders multiplied. Some ships were told to turn back toward the firing contact. Others were ordered to hold course to avoid collision with wreckage. A few attempted to reform the original battle line. None of these instructions were wrong in isolation, but together they conflicted. The fleet began to fracture operationally, even as it remained physically close. Radar showed this immediately. Tracks diverged. Speeds no longer matched. Courses overlapped in awkward ways. What had been a coordinated force minutes earlier was now a collection of ships reacting at different tempos to the same shock. The surviving enemy ship exploited this without urgency. It did not pursue aggressively. It did not attempt to overwhelm. It simply maintained position where its presence forced decisions. Every Japanese maneuver had to account for it now. Every course change risked exposure. That alone was enough. The psychological shift was decisive. Crews who had just believed the fight was over were now thrust back into combat, without preparation, without clarity, and with growing doubt about what was actually happening around them. Gun crews fired on fleeting radar bearings. Some shots splashed harmlessly into empty water. Others landed close but achieved little. Fire was being returned, but without cohesion. Meanwhile, the missing ship continued to act with purpose. Its radar picture was clean. Japanese confusion simplified target selection. The ship did not need to guess which vessels were dangerous. It could see which ones still maneuvered effectively and which ones hesitated. Hesitation was punished. Not always with hits, but with pressure. The threat of accurate fire constrained movement more effectively than damage alone ever could. The Japanese fleet found itself boxed into caution, reacting to a ship it should have eliminated. This was the cost of miscounting. The error was not just numerical, it reshaped the entire decision environment. Commanders could no longer be sure when an engagement phase had truly ended. Every pause now carried risk. Every assumption demanded verification. And verification took time. Time the fleet no longer had. As confusion spread, the battle's character changed. It was no longer about who had lost ships. It was about who still controlled perception, and at this moment, control belonged to the ship that had survived long enough to make doubt contagious. The wrecks had been counted, but the fight was still very much alive. Once confusion took hold, the battle stopped obeying intent. Japanese commanders continued issuing orders, clear, disciplined, logical, but the engagement no longer responded to command the way it had earlier. The presence of the surviving enemy ship altered the battle space faster than instructions could reshape it. Radar ensured that. The moment Japanese ships attempted to re-establish formation, their movements created predictable patterns. Every turn, every speed change, every attempt to regain spacing appeared instantly on the enemy's radar display. The missing ship did not need to interpret intent, it could see it forming in real time. This inverted the fight. Japanese ships reacted to impacts and reports. The surviving ship acted on anticipation. By the time a maneuver was recognized as dangerous, it had already been factored into a firing solution. The engagement began to filter itself. Ships that maneuvered decisively drew attention. Those that slowed or hesitated were bypassed temporarily. Radar made function more important than proximity. A vessel that still influenced the fight mattered more than one already burning or drifting. This created a harsh selection pressure. Captains felt it instinctively. Acting boldly invited accurate fire. Acting cautiously invited isolation. There was no option that restored control, only choices that delayed consequence. The Japanese fleet was no longer shaping the battle. It was being shaped by it. The surviving enemy ship did not need to dominate physically. It only needed to remain present, forcing constant adjustment. That presence denied the fleet any moment of mental closure. The engagement could not be reset while an unresolved threat remained. Command cycles broke down under this pressure. Orders arrived late or contradicted local necessity. Coordination suffered, not from incompetence, but from tempo. The pace of radar-driven combat outstripped traditional command rhythms. What emerged was not chaos, but inevitability. The fight settled into a pattern where outcomes followed motion, not intention. Ships that tried to recover initiative simply made themselves clearer targets. Ships that attempted to disengage exposed clean tracks. The battle reorganized itself around information. And information belonged to the ship that had refused to disappear when the wreck said it should have. From this point forward, the fleet could endure, but it could no longer dictate terms. Understanding finally spread across the Japanese fleet, but it arrived stripped of usefulness. By now it was clear that the engagement had not ended when the guns first fell silent. The surviving enemy ship was not an anomaly or a mistake on a screen. It was an active participant, shaping the battle long after it should have been gone. This realization came quietly. No dramatic announcement. No sudden panic. Just the slow recognition that every assumption made minutes earlier was wrong. Commanders began to grasp the full implication. The tally of wrecks had been premature. One enemy ship had survived long enough to remain tactically relevant, and that survival had poisoned the entire decision-making process that followed. But recognition did not equal recovery. The fleet no longer had the freedom required to reset the fight. Damaged ships could not maneuver aggressively. Undamaged ships were constrained by the need to protect them. Attempts to disengage risked exposing clean radar tracks. Attempts to regroup only concentrated vulnerability. Every option closed another door. Orders were still issued, measured, professional, correct by doctrine, but doctrine itself was failing to produce results. The engagement was no longer responding to intention. It was responding to movement, and movement was being interpreted by radar faster than command cycles could adapt. This was the cruelest phase of the battle. Not collapse. Not rout. Stagnation. Crews continued to fight with discipline. Guns remained manned. Damage control teams worked tirelessly. Courage never disappeared. But courage could not restore initiative once the informational balance had shifted. The surviving enemy ship did not need to press harder. Its mere presence denied closure. As long as it remained active, the fleet could not declare the fight finished and could not move freely enough to escape it. By the time Japanese commanders fully accepted that the engagement had fundamentally changed, there was nothing left to change it back. The battle had crossed a threshold, and once crossed, it could only move forward toward consequences already set in motion. At a certain point, the battle stopped changing shape. Fire still burned, ships still maneuvered, orders still moved through radios and signal lamps, but the engagement itself had settled into a fixed trajectory. Nothing new entered the equation, no fresh opportunity appeared. This is when battles truly end, long before the last shot. The surviving enemy ship had done what it needed to do. It had reasserted presence, disrupted certainty, and forced the Japanese fleet into a reactive posture it could not escape. From here on, every action simply confirmed that reality. Radar showed diminishing variation. Tracks stabilized, speeds equalized at reduced levels. The fleet was no longer seeking advantage, it was managing damage and avoiding further loss. That shift was unmistakable on the screen. For Japanese commanders, this was deeply unsettling. Naval tradition taught that battles turned on decisive moments, bold maneuvers, sudden reversals, dramatic engagements. Here, the decisive moment had been invisible, quiet, and already past. What followed was administration. Fires were controlled, damaged ships were shepherded, spacing was adjusted cautiously. The fleet was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to finish. The surviving enemy ship did not need to pursue aggressively. It allowed distance to grow, confident that the damage had already been done. Its role as disruptor was complete. The irony was stark. The ship that had been counted as wreckage had not destroyed the fleet. It had simply prevented it from restoring confidence. That alone was enough to decide the outcome. The battle did not end with a final blow. It ended when nothing remained that could change its direction. When daylight arrived, it brought clarity, but not opportunity. The sea revealed wreckage, damaged ships, and long trails of oil marking where vessels had burned through the night. Some hulls sat low in the water, others drifted under escort. The picture was sobering, but not surprising. The real revelation was what daylight did not show. There was no decisive enemy force waiting to exploit weakness, no follow-on attack forming on the horizon. The danger had already passed, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded earlier than anyone realized. The Japanese fleet had survived the night, but it had not emerged intact in function. Daylight confirmed what radar had known hours before. The engagement's outcome had been decided by information, not firepower. The fleet's greatest loss was not a ship, it was certainty. The miscount stood exposed. The wrecks had been real. The destruction had been genuine. But the assumption that all threats had been removed was false. One surviving vessel had been enough to reshape the entire encounter. This forced a harsh reassessment. If one ship could be written off incorrectly, then surface indicators could no longer be trusted on their own. Smoke, fire, debris, none of it guaranteed removal from the fight. Daylight did not redeem the night. It documented its lesson. The Japanese warships counted the wrecks because that was how naval battles had always been measured. In the late war, that measure was no longer sufficient. Radar changed the definition of defeat. A ship did not need to look destroyed to be irrelevant, and it did not need to look intact to remain dangerous. What mattered was motion, awareness, and timing. One ship had survived long enough to matter. That survival altered posture, fractured certainty, and forced the fleet into reaction. The engagement did not turn on a dramatic reversal, but on a quiet correction to an incorrect assumption. The most dangerous mistake was not tactical. It was cognitive. Believing the fight was finished reshaped behavior. That behavior created exposure. Exposure gave the surviving ship leverage far beyond its size or firepower. This is how late-war naval battles were decided. Not by the number of wrecks floating on the surface, but by which ships were still moving. After everyone believed they were gone. The wrecks were counted. The missing ship was not. And that single error proved enough to change the course of the night.